Jeez, did this game just yell at me or what? MetalHead is a little-known mech game developed and released by Sega on their 32X peripheral, though little-known might be an understatement. Being a game developed by Sega, a company still seen as a powerhouse in the gaming industry to this day, one would expect there to be at least some information on Wikipedia of all places, but no. Aside from a few scant details about the interface and the thoughts of previous reviewers, there's next to nothing one can find about MetalHead. There could be a few reasons for this though. The 32X was not a very loved addition to the Mega Drive, with the system and its games being heavily rushed. Developers apparently also saw it as a technological dead end, and with the Saturn, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64 on the horizon, it wasn't a promising enough investment for developers, publishers, or even consumers. There is a whole lot more to the story though, and why the public found the idea itself highly confusing. MetalHead as a game is technically a marvel for the time, especially considering the extremely low power of the 32X. Yet it's also incredibly short, with deaths, a few restarts, and without any sort of save state emulator wizardry. I don't think it mattered how impressive something like this was. A measly 2-hour experience isn't going to leave a lasting impression unless it happens to be a movie. So anyhow, how is MetalHead impressive? Well, it features a full 3D world on the 32X, of course. These days, this sort of thing is garbage in comparison to most indie titles, but back in the day, before the Saturn or PlayStation had graced home televisions with countless three-dimensional titles, this sort of thing was mind-blowing. In 1995, the most 3D thing I played was Doom or Duke Nukem 3D. Neither of these had polygonal graphics, just sprites inhabiting 3D boxes. And yeah, the Jaguar had been around for a bit by now, though that thing was a disaster for just about as many reasons as the 32X.
Is that bad? It sounds bad.
It is.
Though I'm not really sure I'd have bought either piece of hardware at the time. Well, had I been an adult instead of a 6-year-old yet to grasp the concept of money or a job. Nowadays, I'm just a clueless nerdwad making videos on the internet, and everything like that is a curiosity to me. And likely if you're watching this video, it's a curiosity to you too. Anyhow, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk a little about what MetalHead even is, aside from it obviously being a mech game. The game's story is admittedly really simple, even for its time. Bipedal weaponry enters development, showing a great deal of promise on the battlefield. Because of this success, numerous entities begin mass producing them, and suddenly, everyone has mech armies at their disposal. The particular mech you pilot is called a MetalHead, and you're tasked with taking down a group of terrorists that have taken over the capital. There isn't much else to be said. Each mission gives you an objective, and you simply accomplish it. The villains you face are almost entirely faceless, and it isn't until the very last boss that you get some semblance of who exactly you're against. Though I really wish this guy had been egging me on from the beginning, because what few lines he has are utterly priceless.
I never expected you to fight this well, but now this will be your graveyard.
Looking at the manual, there doesn't seem to be any extra information whatsoever, though there is a hilarious ad for Doom on the 32X. To me, this is highly ironic considering how absolutely broken the 32X port of Doom was. Somehow this game also has an open ending scene that plays out after the credits, despite next to no story being present. It mentions an evil syndicate which wasn't present in this game at all, unless maybe the terrorist leader was one of these syndicate members. I don't know, it's not like I can actually fault the game for not having a story, especially in a time where console games weren't exactly known for engaging storytelling. The real meat of MetalHead is its gameplay, and though the game barely goes past 15 frames per second, it's still pretty good. If you played anything like Gun Griffin, MetalHead pretty much plays like a simplified version of that. You zip around a few battlefields, taking down numerous mechs and enemy vehicles. While you'll be using a chain gun for the majority of the game, you can purchase a few upgrades between stages with the points you earn by defeating enemies and completing objectives. There isn't a whole lot to play with, only an upgraded version of the chain gun, 2 of a grenade cannon, a couple melee fists, and some extra mines. You can also purchase additional armor and speed increases. I found myself buying the armor quite a bit, especially due to the enemies firing at you from beyond the game's draw distance.
Later, chump!
By today's standard, it isn't even close to something you could download on your phone for free. In 1995 though, this was mind-blowing stuff. Again, I used the word mind-blowing. To have a game that looked like MetalHead and actually be playable on home televisions was a dream for many, especially for those who hadn't heard of or seen the Jaguar. Yes, PCs were doing far better things, but there weren't a whole lot of people with 3D capable computers at home in the mid-1990s. We were all playing like King's Quest and Space Quest.
Alexander pours the contents of the empty-looking ink bottle over himself.
The game has a few bosses, those which range from a giant tank all the way to something one might see out of a Japanese mecha animation. While the vast majority of them require little more than a massive amount of ammunition to take down, there is a boss which players must follow the component of, watching as the literal mech is pieced together, before you have to eventually battle it. The final boss itself is multi-stage, with its first form actually transforming. Again, this stuff isn't anything to write home about these days, but it really was impressive back in the day, trust me. While many of MetalHead's missions are simply about taking out enemy mechs, some of them do require the player to complete an objective. Those objectives do tend to be along the lines of destroying a target of some sort or escaping an area, and yeah, that is pretty much it. The only exception is a sole mission where a helicopter must be escorted. It isn't hard by any means, but the game's limited viewpoints barely let you see where it is, or clue you into the fact that it's actually supposed to follow you. I found this really contrary to the usual escort missions you see in games, but I think it's a little better being able to pace your movement forward in tricky scenarios like this. But the helicopter did get stuck for me on a wall once, and I had no idea where. Only whomping helicopter sounds could be heard. We didn't exactly have dynamic sound yet. Graphically, MetalHead does run like garbage. It doesn't even have the draw distance of something like Iron Soldier, which had a terrible draw distance. The frame rate slows to an absolute crawl when enemies are close, which might be due to the game pushing the living hell out of the 32X hardware. To put it in perspective, the 32X didn't even have the processing power or graphical power of even those cheap smartwatches that you can buy these days. And I'm talking the cheap ones that are like $10 on Temu. This is one of the big reasons I feel it's a shame that there isn't more information out there. MetalHead clearly had a dedicated staff who put a lot of work in, even if it was rushed to create what was basically a tech demo. This has been the only game that showed even a fraction of what the 32X could have been.
That's a shame.
Your handler, a few soldier characters, a shopkeeper, and of course the final boss all have talking animations when they speak. There is an option to change them in the settings, but I couldn't help pass up the opportunity to see 1995 Game Jank in action because these talking photographs are just creepy. These portraits move as if they are puppets wrapped in human skin, faintly imitating human interaction. It has to be seen to be believed, or enjoyed if you're that type of person. Thankfully this is YouTube and I can just show it to you on screen without you having to play at all.
Enough child play. Let's get down to it.
To quote
Scott Bayless, a former Sega technical director,
games in the queue were effectively jammed into a box as fast as possible, which meant massive cutting of corners in every conceivable way. Even from the outset, designs of those games were deliberately conservative because of the time crunch. By the time they shipped, they were even more conservative. They did nothing to show off what the hardware was capable of. MetalHead has to be one of the most impressive 32X games, but that statement does explain why it feels so incomplete. For all the impressive features, the 3D textured graphics, full voice acting with both English and Japanese tracks, which I should have mentioned earlier, it still feels wildly incomplete. You can finish the whole thing within a couple hours, as I said, at most. The game provides you with 3 continues, and it's likely you won't need them if you have any skill with a Sega controller. Had I not died or started the game over several times, I might have completed the game in under an hour and a half, maybe less. Games like this are a curiosity, and you really have to like mechs and obscure gaming hardware to get something out of them. You'd have to be insane to go out and actively collect the 32X in any of its games, unless you still had an old one or found the peripheral dirt cheap, so it's likely you'll be using emulation for this one. It doesn't demand a very high price on eBay or anything like that, but it is still very short, and also a 32X game, which means that even though I found it was pretty good, it's pretty good for a 32X game, which means it's pretty bad in comparison to everything else.
God!
Anyhow, this has been Kei-Nova. Thank you again for watching one of my videos. Please like and subscribe if you haven't already. If you have, well then that's just plain awesome. And if you're new here, you'll know that I have terrible outros. Thank you.
Game over.